Good morning. My name is Lavinia Dondi, and I'm a research fellow at Politecnico di Milano, Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. What I'm going to present today is a part of my research about fragile landscape, framed within the research project Territorial Fragilities, carried on by my department. The title of my contribution is Rural Open Space Perspectives for Fragile Periurban Landscape. The subject of the investigation is the peri-urban landscape considered in its suburban settlements and surrounding countryside. The first lens I used to approach and interpret the fringe areas focused on comparing the ideas of terrain vague, already discussed in the landscape design debate, to the fragility condition to better understand the latter, almost entirely missing in architectural discussion. Ignacio da Sola Morales was the author who described during the 90s a particular condition of territory vagueness that he firstly named with the French expression of terrain vague. The concept started from the awareness of a different sensibility for the city places triggered mainly by urban photography. Marginal, ephemeral, or leftover spaces became fascinating, representing a sort of downside of the regulated urban fabric, expression of the public domain. Vague can be linked to the word unengaged, suggesting an absence but also potential expectation, a possibility of change or redefinition intrinsically related to something missing. Three were the adjectives that De Sola Morales used to summarize the main characteristics of that condition: uninhabited, unsafe, and unproductive. The first suggests a general discomfort linked to the possibility of inhabiting those places. The second implies a perception of unsafety connected to the absence of control. And the third remarks the lack of purposes or well-defined uses. Despite their negative implication, the futures provide a positive mark linked to spontaneous uses and ephemeral traces that future transformations have to preserve and reinterpret. From 2000s onwards, many were the insights and reinterpretations of the Sola Morales idea. In 2014, the American writer and professor Patrick Barron defined terrain vague as counter spaces containing a fragmented history. Those places animate the landscape through paradoxical combinations: vacancy and freedom, absence and possibility, limitlessness and mobility, urban and rural. Some years later, Mariana Mogilevich, an American-based historian of architecture and urbanism, focused on the risk of improving terrain vague through the same generalized formula as a contradictory effect of the globalized urbanism of the 21st century. Two are the main impacts of the marginal space reuse rooted in the 60s and 70s cutting-edge urban experiences. On the one hand, the possibility of gentrification, and on the other, a dark perspective without any upgrades. Instead, a way to be put in the middle provides transformation of the physical space to go hand in hand with a more complex enhancement process, comprising policies activation and spatial governance to preserve the value of urban commons. The England-based writer and artist Gilles Doron began to deepen the topic in the 2000s, emphasizing how the areas in which a terrain vague condition displays are never empty spaces, as too often the establishment considers them. On the contrary, those areas are always animated by the transitory coexistence of minorities, people, green spaces, or animals, being places for weak or soft identities and counterbalancing the ordinary urban spaces. Moreover, Doron controversially named these areas dead zone, exasperating a common negative perception that took both to tabula rasa operation or, however, to a general underestimation of these spaces. Dead zones are also sites in which different forms of excess and transgression occur, but when the experience of the void, residue, or downsides exceeds, the spaces become unbalanced, developing negative consequences. Concerning fragility, the idea we deal with refers to territory having a solid connection to the analysis of specific sites and moments in history. The territorial fragility has a multidimensional character as the territory. It's about complex situations to face through a cross-disciplinary approach. Comparing terrain value to fragility, we can observe the same positive focus on resources and redeeming possibilities linked to the uncertainty of definitions, rather than focusing on the criticalness of the sites as the concept of dead zones does. The transformation to come have to be aware and recognize those peculiar conditions. As the terrain vague and dead zones, a fragile scenario suffers from unbalanced features to deal with. Both present borderline situations in which something can easily exceed or already has, breaking a precarious balance. Finally, a general perception of inhabiting discomfort, unsafeness, linked to various aspects and different levels of disengagement are common traits of all conditions. On the contrary, what differs is the relation with the factors linked to each of the situations. If the territorial fragility represents the possibility or the predisposition to develop dangerous effects related to adverse phenomena, vague dead zone situations show most of the times the unpredictable consequences of something already happened and not always related to specific phenomena, but primarily to intrinsic features of the sites. As a result, we can consider the peri-urban areas, the subject of the research, a territory in which the vagueness is more perceived than in the denser part of the city. That condition, as we have seen, opens possibilities of redefinition, accepts transitory uses and soft identities, but the border between opportunities, disengagement, and undesirable consequences is very fragile. First of all, the vagueness of that territory concerns the absence of crucial urban relations or convincing agricultural landscapes. The fabric's openness weakened the network of the relational spaces, unable to intertwine effective connection if not supported by the closeness of the building masses. And the countryside emerges as a residual space, ready to be invaded by the urban fabric, planned as the real focus of the territory. But despite the vagueness, the transition between the two domains, urban and rural, appears problematic. Planners often thought of them separately, without shared networks, places, or uses. Therefore, what visualizes the vagueness the most is the fragmentation of the open spaces network, a substantial and strategic part, but wholly inadequate in inhabiting urban places and ineffective for the transition to the surrounding countryside. However, the situation of the peri-urban areas is even more complex. It's not only about a general condition of discomfort and disengagement, but resources are often threatened constantly by negative phenomena. Soil consumption, abandonment or neglect of spaces, ecological fragmentation, pollution, and environmental risks, among which we focus the ones concerning the water. The possibility to develop undesirable effects make the peri-urban areas fragile, proving that fragility is a possible development of a vagueness condition. Focusing on the regeneration of open spaces as one of the most ineffective components of the peri-urban settlements, water represents a crucial element to work with, fixing imbalance phenomena in hydraulic and environmental terms. Climate change effects, together with inadequate ways to anthropize the territories, increase the possibility of hydraulic inefficiency, and peri-urban areas with dilated networks of open spaces appear strategic in counteracting the damages of the denser part of the city as well. Environmentally speaking, too, suburban places represent a buffer between the city and the countryside. It can work as an ecological filter for the water running from urban areas to the rural side, or in the same way from suburban industrial settlements to the denser city. Specifically, acting on suburban streams appears a pivotal operation both for the environmental and hydraulic regeneration of the territory and for the landscape redefinition of the role of watermarks in the setting. Small and medium-sized streams, more than the major ones, are so often scarcely considered in the developing of the layout, but on the contrary, they are very crucial in mending network of transitional open spaces between countryside and suburban areas. Accordingly, working on the vaguest pointers of the suburban settlements, focusing primarily on the rural side and open spaces, appears decisive in defining a possible regeneration process for the peri-urban areas. The goals are the development of a more efficient relation between countryside and urban side, fixing the idea of a residual rural landscape to be invaded by building and expansion, and therefore the improvement of the layout of the open spaces to be considered as the sediment backbone connecting rural and urban places. In planning and design terms, the development of peri-urban fringes in the European cities started during the reconstruction after World War II, triggered by the crisis of the countryside and the massive movement of people to the urban areas, together with the public will to increase the infrastructures of the countryside, mostly where the openness of the fabric allowed it. The intensification of cars and minor costs of the peri-urban areas sustained the planning operation toward a rapid modernization of the city. The step after, which ended in the 90s, generated peri-urban areas as we know them today, dealing with the crucial topics of sprawl and suburb. The countryside still offered the cheapest soil to consume and often neglected rural spaces to reimagine and be inhabited by people looking for dilated places in opposition to the denser city. One of the fundamental challenges of those settlements was the peripheralization, due to the lack of connections both to urban facilities and the rural side, the one we focused. Accordingly, the local public networks for the collectivity appears insufficient. Private and fragmented instances inform the territory more than a renewed idea of community. In this frame, the agri-urban idea represented one of the most valuable landscape visions to face peri-urban occurrences, focusing on the countryside and open spaces among the vaguest boundary and territory challenges. The idea was conceived during the 90s mainly by the French landscape tradition and in particular by Pierre Donadieu. It's still crucial in the debate because peri-urban areas remain one of the most problematic types of land use that the 20th century has bequeathed to the 21st. The French-based concept focused on new inhabiting forms of the peri-urban countryside, no more contemplated as an expansion possibility for the city, but envisioned as a necessary multifunction open space, equally considered in the development of the layout to the urban side. Rural areas have to include leisure activities for the peri-urban citizen, going beyond agricultural production and generating a transitional buffer between urban and rural in which open spaces correspond to the backbone of the connection. Landscape design solutions are still generating interpretations of that idea. Post-productive and porous countryside spaces work as peri-urban recreational areas, considering rural instances before the urban ones and softening the ever-present dichotomy between the two domains. Analyzing a collection of case studies dealing with the regeneration of peri-urban areas, two typologies of rural-urban reconnection strictly linked to the geography of the existing emerge clearly. The first strategy works on the thickening of the border, conceiving an in-between space as a place in its own right, a new scenario that occurs as intermediate between the city and the countryside. The second strategy, instead, still working on buffer areas, focuses on those elements going beyond the border and entrusts them with the rejoin of the lacerated fabric. Landscape architect Michel Devigne, belonging to the French landscape tradition, dealt with the first strategy since the beginning of the 2000s, designing new in-between conditions in which a triple urban agricultural and social ecology could thrive. The project for the edge of the Paris-Saclay area represents a crucial case study concerning border thickening operations to reconnect peri-urban places. On the other hand, Dutch landscape architect Bernard Strootman, connected to another strong landscape tradition such as the Dutch one, worked on this topic by deepening mainly the second strategy. Improving the landscape in proximity to the city means developing coherent visions in which ecological networks, storage and filtering of water, and sustainable agriculture cooperate. Linear elements, as water streams or paths, become the drivers for the reconnection as the solution for the landscape park powers in Tilburg were well testified. As we said, focusing on the regeneration of open spaces as one of the most ineffective components of the peri-urban settlements, water represents a crucial element to work with. Acting on suburban streams appears strategic, both in landscape terms, redefining the role of small and medium-sized watermarks in the setting, and in environmental and hydraulic terms, counteracting the undesirable effects of the fragile water balance. During almost the 20th century, the European tendency was to rectify or even drain the watercourses, mostly the small or medium-sized ones, to get more urban and infrastructural development spaces. Car viability was one of the essential marks of the modernity era to improve, and soil remained environmentally defenseless for decades. Concerning the urban fabric, watercourses were drained due to hygienical topics too, being together with wastewater. Moreover, till the last decades, water management operated from a completely different perspective than today. The main objective was to discharge the flood wave downstream as fast as possible. In fact, channel watercourses increased the rapidity of the water, but at the same time, surface or underground canalizations destroyed natural habitats and environmental ecosystems beyond dilating landscape marks. On the contrary, a more recent flood management approach stresses the rainwater keeping where it falls, promoting the degrees of rapidity through renaturalization of the watercourses, infiltration, and water storage. However, if significant streams have begun to be the protagonists of regeneration processes, small and medium streams are still underestimated as a resource, most of all in Italy. Tampering with the waterways compromised the hydraulic functioning, the ecological importance, and the architectural and landscape value of the watermarks. Beyond the watercourse size, starting from the regaining of that value as territorial mark becomes essential. Within the countryside, irrigation networks, including canals, channel streams, and sometimes natural streams, represents one of the three elements to define the landscape, together with agricultural soil and path network. Thus, from the countryside to the settlements, watercourses need to be announced as drivers of agricultural and urban settings. Linear marks related and not denied to the design of the other timeless components of the territory, imagined as the ardor we inhabit. In so doing, watercourses define continuity marks capable of overcoming the dichotomy between rural and urban domains, offering practical mending elements acting within the open space. Interdisciplinary processes of watercourse regeneration need to involve landscape, hydraulic, and environmental issues to design effective reconnection solutions. Furthermore, resetting an area where water plays a central role implies another design topic concerning landscape mutability. Cyclical mutability linked to flooding or low season of the watercourses, and sudden mutability linked to atmospheric events capable of quickly distorting the characteristics of a site. Considering periurban areas as a buffer to solve environmental and hydraulic imbalance phenomena means providing the dilated open spaces with landscape flooding disposals or ecological filters to prevent or counteract any damages linked to floods, runoff, or awakening processes as groundwater depletion and water quality deterioration. Thus, natural basins or enlargements with different dimension and vegetation are located between the denser city and the countryside, defining transitional landscape where the mutable presence of water identifies places that differ each time. A design process oriented by the dynamics and rhythm of the water is essential to provide practical strategies for dealing with water spaces. However, what is changeable is the view of the areas and how we can experience them through disposals to go closer to the water or parks. Various water levels allow their use, each time differently. Moreover, a changeable quantity of water is a positive trait also in environmental terms. It means variable vegetation and seasonal connection between different habitats that visitors can observe. Accordingly, opportunities for multiple experiences along the streams are also crucial for increasing recreational activity to get a multifunctional countryside where citizens can raise awareness on water, environmental, and ecological topics and play sport activities. Conclude, but also to open fertile reflections. I think that peri-urban areas considered as buffers need a crucial improvement in their vague and uncertain open spaces, as dilated to contain disposals to relate rural and urban elements, facing ecological and hydraulic issues and fixing the fragile balance concerning water. The landscape architect's vision, a cross-color and multidisciplinary one, works as a mediation between natural built elements and people gestures, assuring anti-fragile and adaptive processes to be efficient in resetting the landscape. Thank you for your attention.